Hi, I'm Conor Friedersdorf, a staff writer at The Atlantic magazine.
And I'm James Poulos, a writer and the proprietor of the Free Radicals podcast and newsletter.
And we're going to start today by talking about Smarm. There was a big piece that went viral in Gawker, and it posited that what is wrong with the culture today isn't snark, it is Smarm. And what we should be inveighing against is this sort of trick that smarmy people play, where they try to come along and make us feel bad about being critical, even when being critical is deserved. Is that a fair summary, do you think, of the Gawker piece?
Yeah, that's about right. I mean, this is sort of the idea that Smarm is almost a religious crusade for a certain kind of not particularly religious person. And it's not just about enforcing and policing no snark zones. But it's also, what do you fill the space with? Well, you fill it with like really authentic, sincere compliments about how good and positive and up-worthy things are.
Right. And so Gawker, of course, is sometimes criticized for its snark, and then there is this wave of sites that are doing smarmy material. Upworthy is one of the biggest and most well-known, and the headline style of Upworthy, I don't know if people have noticed this, but it has really been kind of rocketing around the magazine world, and you've been seeing it a lot on non-Upworthy-like sites because it is doing fantastic on Facebook and elsewhere. People right now are sharing this style of headline quite a bit. I tend to think that it is a passing fad, that it is novel right now, and but once you give people positive in headlines, eventually that is going to be a depleting currency, and we'll go back kind of to where things were before. But you had a really smart reaction to the Smarm piece, and why don't you tell everybody what that was?
So, I think the piece was pretty good because it wasn't just a whack at Smarm. And, Smarm is a thing. It's a real thing that's out there, and I'm sure we've all run into it at one time or another. But I think, at the heart of the piece was this idea that snark and Smarm are kind of codependent, that we oscillate back and forth between this sort of snarky mode and this sort of smarmy mode. And the snarky people hate the Smarm, and the smarmy people hate the snark. But the rest of us just kind of, indulge in one or the other and wonder if it's possible to have a middle ground anymore, or whether the middle ground exists but sucks, or what the deal is. And my reaction to the piece was driven by something that any good Straussian tells you, that the truth of what a political theorist is saying is right in the middle of their work. So if you really want to understand Machiavelli, you turn to the middle of the Prince and you read that chapter first. In the middle of the Smarm piece was the revelation that the piece actually came out of a conversation that the author had with some unnamed award-winning writer. And the advice that the writer gave or was giving to students or would-be students was, look, if you want to make a name for yourself in this media world, this crazy mixed-up media world, go write about someone obscure. And I thought, well, there it is. For a certain kind of media person, for a certain kind of ambitious person, smart person, whatever, the obscure person is always and must always be someone else. Not me, the media guy, can't be obscure. There is a fear of obscurity that's powered by, I think, just sort of our, egocentric selves, but also by the media landscape of the internet, where everything is flattened out and equalized. And, it seemed for a minute like the internet was going to be some great engine for discovering greatness and great for upward mobility. It hasn't really been that. It's created this massive content, and it's thrown people back on the resources of tastemakers and gatekeepers. Which is fine as far as it goes, but it does, I think, inculcate this sort of terror that that media people and that people who spend a lot of time on the internet feel, which is this fear of being obscure. Obscurity is always for someone else. It's for flyover country. It's there's all kinds of stuff wrapped up in this. But I thought the big hook there was, hey, for a lot of Americans, it's possible to live a perfectly great obscure life. Obscurity is not a death sentence. But for a lot of people caught up in the snark and smarm conversation, it looks like obscurity is kind of this terrifying thing that people want to avoid at all costs.
It really is interesting that we are living in this time when, you hear stories about middle schoolers or maybe early high schoolers who have signed up for their first Facebook account, and there's this social dynamic where they're terrified of posting something that doesn't get enough likes, or they're terrified of being on Twitter and not having enough followers. You heard kind of the same thing at the dawn of the reality television era, where it was like an everybody wants to be famous era. And yet, at the same time, we're living in this era where everyone is playing in this currency of notoriety that everyone can play in now that the internet has kind of given anyone the tools to put up a YouTube video or get on Facebook or whatever and have something go viral. At the same time, we're in an era where people are terrified of their obscurity being invaded, or maybe not their obscurity being invaded, but their privacy being invaded. They're terrified of being the person who does something that goes viral because someone recorded it on a cell phone, or because someone hacked into their computer and posted a naked photo of them. And so there's this simultaneous sense where everyone wants to be maximally famous, but also retain their privacy. They want both of these things and do not give a lot of thought to the trade-offs that inevitably come with them.
And that's not, that's just a trend that's been exacerbated by the internet. It has been created by it. It's easier to become suddenly spontaneously famous now. But this is, welcome to being human, where, you want as much attention and status and sort of comparison making that's favorable to you as you can get on your own terms. And when it's time to get sort of the short end of the stick, or eat your vegetables, and be ridiculed and be maybe taken out and have enemies and all that stuff, then you hate it.
Right. Yeah, I guess it's true that this impulse has always been around. I was reading a while back about the series of people that decided to go over Niagara Falls in a barrel in order to gain fame. And this impulse pops up in different places throughout American history, and maybe throughout the history of a lot of different countries. I think what's different now, I think one thing that's different now is that there is this way in which the internet permits you to become suddenly famous in a way that you have no control over whatsoever. And you're suddenly an object of national ridicule in what seems like a moment's notice. And I think these moments are often fleeting. If the people in them kind of had a broader perspective, they would realize that if they just kind of wrote it out and didn't talk to anyone for a few days or maybe a week, people would move on to a different target and they could just keep going about their business. But there definitely is, when you're in the middle of these maelstroms, something intense and perhaps unprecedented about what seems as if, and is literally thousands and thousands of people all over the world kind of heaping scorn on you perhaps for an out of context moment, or for something that you said on the internet, or whatever it may be.
Yeah, that's right. Politicians have learned this lesson, some of them better than others. It's bad press. I'm just going to not answer questions for, a week and hope, and let sort of my PR people just send out a flurry of press releases that counter program and then kind of write it out. The fact that most ordinary people find this harder to do than the average politician is, in one sense, like good news, right, for humanity, probably.
Right.
But in another sense, it sort of like raises, I think, some questions about like where we're at culturally when it comes to things like resilience. If we all have egos like that big and that fragile, that's probably bad news for humanity on balance. If someone finds themselves in that kind of situation where they are sort of, hauled in front of the great internet comment box show trial, and it's an experience that they can't really recover from, we have to get better at that if we're going to prevail in this internet era that we live in. And how we're going to get better at that, that's a good question. Upworthy has a lot of great stuff. I'm not trying to sort of use Upworthy as a way of mocking the internet. But one thing that you probably won't get out of the TED Talk or won't get out of an Upworthy segment or, won't get out of an ideas festival is how to be resilient
right.
in that way. And I think that's an important point to make.
Yeah, I think probably the ability of people to be resilient in these online conflagrations depends partly on their offline life and whether they have a support network of friends or family or even colleagues or coworkers, small communities that they maybe play sports with or whatever the case may be. And there's a sense in which the internet has allowed people who have the most social problems interacting in offline life to have this new kind of venue and to be able to create their own persona and to, or maybe even to portray who they actually are in a medium that allows them to be less socially awkward and to actually kind of break through their shyness and get it out there. And yet, at the same time, so these most vulnerable people, when they're online and when they're doing this and when it's this great outlet, are at the same time the most vulnerable to the internet turning on them and then having kind of no other support network to run to in the way that people who don't think of the online world as much of their life do have a kind of escape where you can just kind of shut the computer and not care what they're saying on Twitter for a few hours.
There are folks I know on the political right who complain on Twitter from time to time about how Twitter disputes, especially about say guns, bleed over into real life, and you have the sort of bothersome spectacle of death threats on the internet becoming like letters mailed to people's houses, and
right.
there can be some real paranoia there and justified paranoia, and it's not confined to one side of the political spectrum or the other. I mean, if we really want to talk about why we should be concerned about the potential of the internet, I think we have to talk about you can really organize more or less permanent communities of bad people, people who wish to do ill and who are in a really bad place. Be they, sort of members of the international jihad, or whether they be sort of like, violent sort of pervy types or whatever. And you can have like this ecosystem where they can just live, and it is sort of 24-hour, 24-hour safe space for dangerous people. You don't want to close down huge chunks of the internet. And indeed, it seems almost impossible to do that based on what we've seen with like Silk Road. But it is, it is something to be concerned about.
Yeah. I wonder, I wonder how, 15 years ago, how young people will be thinking about what we call the virtual world and how real it is. Having been of the generation that kind of bridged the pre-internet world and the post-internet world, I at least am always, at least mostly inclined to think of it as this kind of separate thing that is distinct from, in real life as it is in the acronym. And I wonder what it will be like for people who, grew up as babies playing with iPads and have interacted online and always had that as a part of their lives and a part of the kind of core fabric of what society is.
Yeah, I'm hoping it's going to be like a mixed bag at worst. I have a 4-year-old son, and he's already, an ad pops up or whatever on my phone or on my computer, and he can just dispatch it immediately without skipping a beat. I was driving him to school the other day, and he's in the back seat, sort of looking at billboards or whatever. It's LA, so there's a lot of stuff to look at. And he says, Dad, people on TV are always saying, buy this, buy this, buy this. And I laughed, and he said, I wish that we had a clicker that could turn off those channels. 4 years old.
Yeah.
And I said, well, yeah, I mean, you want to know something even more ridiculous? And he was like, yeah, I do, because he's interested in absurdities. It's when you're 4, something absurd is probably going to be funny.
Mm-hmm.
So he's like ready for me to say what's next. And I say, okay, so get this. Like, not only can't you get rid of those ads on TV, but that's how the things that you see on TV pay for themselves. And then you have to actually pay someone in order to see them. So you're actually paying someone to tell you to buy something that you don't already want. And his mind was just blown. It just didn't make sense to him.
Right.
And we can laugh about it. And I'm not saying that the business model of television is unjust in some way. If you want to watch the Super Bowl,
right.
Pay to watch the Super Bowl. But I do think that even right now, kids. One of the most shocking things that I heard recently, and in hindsight, not that shocking, just sad. Online bullying, right? So you go to school, you get bullied, you go home, and the same bastards are like harassing you at home on Facebook or Snapchat or wherever.
Right. Yeah.
There's no interruption.
Yeah.
And it's no surprise kids are cracking under pressure and killing themselves.
Yeah.
Over this stuff, because it's 24/7 around the clock. Intimidation and harassment.
Mm-hmm.
So I hope that these kids who are growing up with iPads get a little bit more to go back to resilience, the ability to just kind of like take it in stride. It's like not about me. It's about sort of the the flaws of this system, or the things that the system sort of allows to go on. And here are some workarounds. And I don't know if you want to call that a hacker mentality to abuse and harassment, but maybe it's a form of resilience that has yet to emerge.
Yeah. Let's move on to talking a little bit about surveillance. Some of the latest revelations from the Edward Snowden documents were just reported in the Washington Post by Barton Gellman, talking about how the NSA collects cell phone location data. And I have a piece up today that kind of harkens back to right when the initial Edward Snowden document came out, and Glenn Greenwald reported on the Verizon program to collect metadata on the phone calls of virtually all Americans. The initial story was Verizon business customers, but it soon became clear that basically all of the companies were doing this. And back then, the NSA and its and various Obama administration officials really kind of spoke in very misleading ways about how about whether or not they collected location data. They kept saying, under this program, we do not collect location data. It wouldn't make sense for us to do that. And in fact, they were collecting cell phone location data, just not under that program. They were doing it under different programs that we didn't know about yet. And I kind of laid that all out in my piece. And the other interesting thing that's come up in surveillance news recently is that there was this survey of writers that an organization, PEN, I think. I forget what PEN stands for, but anyway, they surveyed American writers, and this is like novelists, right? And asked them if the surveillance revelations and the idea of the NSA kind of monitoring internet communications and phone calls and that kind of thing, has that changed the way you write and made you avoid certain controversial topics, they asked. And something like 15 or 20% said, yes, this has made us avoid certain topics. And there's been some skepticism toward these people. David Simon, creator of The Wire, was kind of mocking them, and Rod Dreher as well did a post kind of mocking them. And their take was basically, seriously, you think the NSA is worried about the influence of American fiction writers? Like, you vastly overestimate your importance. And if you are a writer of fiction and you're scared away by the NSA monitoring you, then you're not a very good public intellectual or writer of fiction. I think that was basically Rod's take. But to me, this story is something that I worry about a lot, and not just writers, that people generally will change their behavior in very subtle ways because of the idea that big data is being used to mine their communications and to connect scary people to other scary people, and they don't want to be a false positive, basically. And so I think that people will have that kind of thought in the back of their head when they're Googling something or when they're writing an email through a commercial service that they know is being scanned for ads and perhaps for God knows what else. And I think that this is a troubling thing, to have this double consciousness where everyone is thinking all the time, I don't want to make myself suspicious to the government. And I don't think we're there yet, but I think that the way that data is being used by the NSA puts us in danger of going there, and that in small ways, lots of people probably do this already. So I wonder what your take is on all of that.
I think there's a paradox at work here, and you've been great on these issues. And if whomever is watching this hasn't read your piece on this, they should sort of double screen it here and pull it up while they hear us yammering on. And you've been great on these issues for a while now, so I commend you, young man. Yeah, people do change their behavior in these subtle ways. I don't think it's just sort of like Jonathan Franzen being like, I can't, no, I'm not going to let the government read Jonathan Franzen's emails,
Right. Yeah.
It is regular folk out there, and lots of them. But at the same time, I feel like there's a countervailing instinct too, which is this sort of like cynical resignation, like, the government's going to find out anything about me anyway, like, they know too much already. Why should I put up a fight? It's a waste of time to try to keep my privacy intact. It's, I'm sort of trying to become famous anyway. It would be nice if I did, so why hide,
Yeah.
There's that logic at work too. And so I think we're probably going to see both. We're going to see people increasing their anxiety level about what the shadowy powers that be know about them and how they're being monitored. And then also kind of pair that with this fatalistic, like, screw it, I'm already stuck on the internet sort of attitude.
Mm-hmm.
And after all, it's like, if I like don't have a lot of friends and I'm looking for a date and I can't find someone to set me up with a friend of theirs, am I going to like not use Tinder because the government might, it's like the reality of people's lives is going to, I think, continue to pull them into these kinds of online interactions where they might feel like hopeful that some kind of personal data doesn't get out. And now we're back to what we talked about earlier, which is people, having this information somewhere online and feeling kind of like helpless and like, well, it'll suck if this gets out, but that doesn't mean I'm going to, delete my Facebook or like delete my Google account.
Yeah. One of the things that I worry about is that, Tinder isn't going to go away, and people browsing the internet for pornography aren't going to go away, even though those are things that people would not necessarily want to be made public, because the benefits that they provide are high enough for people to just say, screw it, I'm just going to do this. And for most people, it won't be a problem, and that's what they're betting on. What I worry about more are the areas in which the benefits aren't so high, right? And you can think about it as like, I think right now, if someone had a negative interaction with the IRS, right, they might be a little bit hesitant to go and write on Facebook about that. Because right in the back of their mind, they would think like, I don't want to invite an audit or something like that. And that's the kind of political speech that I'm worried about. I'm worried about associations, someone not wanting to like Glenn Greenwald's article or page on Facebook or something like that, or not wanting to give money to a charity that they believe in, but that is connected to being very critical of the government. Those are the kind of things that people can much more easily say, well, just to be safe, I'm not going to do this thing that I otherwise would because the benefit to me really isn't that high. The potential downside, it probably won't happen, but potential downside is huge. So I'm just not going to do that kind of thing. And I was reading an article about this. I forget where. Maybe I can dig it up before this posts. But it was basically saying, do we want all of American society to be like an airport? Meaning, if you're in the airport with your friend and you're going on a trip together, there are certain things not to talk about in the airport, right? You're not going to stand in the security line and make a joke about a bomb. You're not going to talk about smoking marijuana. They're just, it isn't even something you think about, but you're self-censoring. And is that kind of mindset going to spread to other areas of society in the age of big data, where an innocent Google search for backpacks and then the next day pressure cooker, maybe that's going to trigger some scrutiny, and maybe you don't want to be scrutinized in that way.
Yeah, I think this is one area where people might actually change their behavior. It's the threat of being found out probably won't stop a lot of people from using porn or whatever. But yeah, don't want to get audited. Mm-hmm. Why not? It's not just because being audited is inconvenient. It's that the stakes are so high for so many people. This isn't just like, those lawyers complaining about the IRS and it's just, get over it, you guys. This is, I think, a canary in the coal mine kind of situation. Much like, arguably, the Republican Party's having some trouble right now. It's really hard to coalition build. The radical fringe is making it harder for the establishment. Well, that's going to happen to the Democrats too if things continue along their current trend. And in fact, it already has started happening. So this is another one of those instances as well. And this is why I complain about the conversation over income inequality. Yes, there's income inequality, and yes, it bugs us because there's so much equality in so many other spheres of life that it's offensive to us to see this one area of life that's so important surrounding money and finance that seems to be so impervious to the equalizing forces that are sort of having their way with us in so many other areas of life. But why is that even part of the conversation on a practical level, not like an ideological or conceptual one? It's because so many people have like a negative net worth. So many people are in debt. So many people cannot bear any kind of serious financial risk, or they cannot weather any kind of serious financial storm. That's why we've got people locked into unemployment. That's why we've got people who are worried about healthcare costs because they can't afford. $5,000 bill. Sorry, this is people who are in the middle class and out of the middle class. Mm-hmm. People at every level of sort of economic productivity in America. You can find lots of people who depend on federal money, depend on subsidies, depend on targeted tax cuts. And why? It's because people don't have net worth. You've got some billionaires and some millionaires out there who've got money stored away. And yeah, you've got a tiny number of middle-class people and below who have some money saved up. But our savings rate is in the tank. Generally speaking, it doesn't matter what class you're in. And when people are worried about, getting into it with the government and with money, an audit for someone with a negative net worth, who is basically living paycheck to paycheck or so, that's like probably, heading toward catastrophe land. Mm-hmm. And this is a problem that reaches across, internet and real life, across, upper class, lower class, middle class, working class. This is a problem that's not going to go away. This is a problem that we're not talking about because, when the answer is, you just like tax, just raise the income tax on rich people, or raise the estate tax on rich people. That doesn't address the problem of massive private debt. And when you live in a society with massive private debt, you get behaviors that produce a whole culture and a whole way of understanding our relationship to government that you just don't get when people have even a modest amount of money saved up.
It's interesting. I have nothing as interesting to say in response, so we should probably move on to the next topic.
Let's do it.
And that is the view from nowhere. The view from nowhere is a phrase that Jay Rosen coined to describe the ideology of the news media. This idea that if you read a newspaper that presents itself as giving you the news objectively, that its journalists are presented as if they are coming from absolutely nowhere at all, that they are just giving you the facts and the facts only in a way that is disconnected from any ideological preconceptions or any framing of the story. And of course, this is impossible. Every human being and every journalist comes to every story that they write with certain ideas in mind that affect the kinds of reporting that they do, the questions they ask, the people they choose to talk to, the way that they present the story, the headline that they write, the information that they lead with, and all these kinds of things. And so Jay Rosen for a long time has been advocating that instead of pretending that our reporters are coming from nowhere and enforcing these strictures where they aren't allowed to say who they voted for in the last election or what their opinion might be on a subject they've covered for a long time and where they've developed expertise, we should have the view from somewhere where journalists basically say, look, here's where I'm coming from. Maybe it's political, maybe it's ideological, maybe it's something completely different. Maybe it's, I'm coming from an outsider's position, or I'm coming from the South of the United States, and that's where I grew up, and I bring that with me to the stories I report on it. Whatever it may be, just trying to be transparent about this is what I'm bringing to the story, and have that in mind as you judge my story and as you figure out how to assimilate its information into your larger worldview. And I bring this up now, although Rosen's been writing about it for a long time, because there's this new venture, NewCo, that most famously Glenn Greenwald is joining, and it's funded to the tune of $250 million by someone who made their money in the tech business. And it is going to have journalists like Glenn Greenwald who are presenting a kind of view from somewhere. And they've hired Jay Rosen to be an advisor. And so his kind of theoretical framework is going to have a real-world outlet. And we're going to see what would it mean for a big news organization that is focused on breaking news and not just commentary. What would it mean if they had the view from somewhere? And I am very curious to see what it will mean.
Yeah, this is good news. I know there are people out there who look at Glenn's work and roll their eyes or worse, who say like, well, it's one thing to disclose this sort of massive, creepy American surveillance state, but now you're just giving away state secrets and no. And okay, right, I get it, but you're right to center this conversation around what the upshot is for journalism more broadly. When I think about the view from nowhere, this is Jay Rosen applying to journalism. This insight, which I guess you could trace back to like Friedrich Nietzsche, who complained / mocked, laughed at philosophers, analytical philosophers who tried to philosophize from the standpoint of nowhere, who were trying to achieve this objective neutrality in understanding the world and our place in it and all that sort of stuff. For Nietzsche, he took a pretty radical road in reaction to the view from nowhere, and ultimately came down on the side of all philosophy is basically autobiography, which when I first read that, I was sort of like, maybe. But the older I get, the more obvious that seems, and not just philosophy, but it's like, gosh, everything that we talk about is deeply influenced by who we are, and who we are ultimately, I would contend, is a question not of what we do or what we look like, but how we are, how we choose to be. So if you're talking about journalism that's premised on a view from nowhere or a view from somewhere, I think the great promise of that is that what it is journalism that is a view from someone in particular, who is knowable to us in virtue of how it is that they are, how they approach their work, how they approach their life, how they approach those around them and those around the world. That's a good basis for journalism, for public writing, for engaging public minds with events and with news and with ideas. And to the extent that that kind of journalism gets funding, I think the upshot is, hopefully, that people will start to think of themselves more in terms of how they are, and less in terms of sort of what institution they belong to or what it is that they quote unquote do for a living, all that sort of stuff.
Mm-hmm. People who are interested in this subject would also do well to read this exchange between Glenn Greenwald and Bill Keller of the New York Times, and they kind of argued about these two models, about basically the New York Times model and the Jay Rosen model, it's interesting how thoroughly Keller is convinced that the view from nowhere is possible. And I say this as a tremendous fan of the New York Times generally. I think they do a ton of great work, and that they, often writing in the objective news style, and kind of hewing to those conventions, they manage to do great things. I would just argue that there is such tremendous framing to almost everything that they do. And it isn't indefensible framing. Oftentimes it's perfectly fine. Sometimes it's objectionable, and I would argue against it. But, in every case, they could defend it, and there's a reason for it. I think the problem is that they sometimes seem blind to it in a way that almost no one who reads the New York Times is blind to it. And I often wonder, there's another instance a while back where I wrote about this deal that Goldman Sachs did, where they basically picked assets that were designed to fail and didn't tell the investors in a product that they were doing this. And Goldman Sachs eventually apologized for this, and I think paid a settlement, certainly publicly apologized and said this was the wrong thing to do. So I'd written this story, and someone put this phrase from my story on a sign and went out during Occupy Wall Street. And I don't remember the whole unwieldy phrase because it was unwieldy, but it was basically, in essence, it is wrong for Goldman Sachs to have done this thing, and the thing was obviously wrong. And actually, Goldman Sachs wasn't even mentioned by name. It was just, it is wrong to mislead your investors about this particular kind of investment product or something like that. And so this guy puts it on a sign. He goes out with his girlfriend. They're at the Occupy Wall Street protest. He goes to the bathroom. She's holding the sign. She happens to be photographed holding the sign. And it turns out that she is an employee of WNYC in New York, public radio station. And this public radio station fires her for the offense of being seen in public holding a sign that wasn't neutral, thus ostensibly sullying the reputation of WNYC, I suppose, as a neutral source of news. And I think it's the example I always go back to when I talk about the absurdity of this ideology, because who in the world, first of all, doesn't think that it's wrong for Goldman Sachs to have misled these people in this way that even Goldman Sachs apologized for, and it was in fact illegal, right? This is not a controversial proposition. You might as well fire someone for standing on the street with a sign that says fraud is wrong. And beyond that, who in the world thinks that WNYC, New York's public radio station, is a radio station where no one on staff is at all friendly to Occupy Wall Street's critique of big Wall Street banks, right? No one in the world thinks this is true. And yet, this is the reputational capital that WNYC was worried about keeping. And I think, kind of by the same token, the New York Times is a center-left newspaper. It's socially liberal in the causes that it champions in that realm. It has a bias, I would argue, toward leaders in the national security state generally. It doesn't always go along with what they say, but it is generally friendly to American power and American hegemony and the national security state's claims about keeping Americans safe and what's necessary for that. And these things are just realities, and there's no way to get around it. The newspaper has to make decisions about what to cover, how to frame it, what to report, what not to report. And I think that the word Bill Keller uses is impartial by claiming that impartiality is possible. It just neglects having to address why you made the decisions you made and being upfront about them.
Yeah, this raises all kinds of issues. We could just do a whole segment, a whole episode on this stuff. But here's how I think I want to talk about it. Yeah, there are facts. There are things that are facts and things that are more facty than other things. But regardless of who you are, where you work, where you live, or how dedicated you are to capital J journalism, when you're in the business of talking about events and talking about people and talking about news, you are always going to inscribe a circle that delineates for you the realm of possibility. And your facts, that you say, hey, I care about facts. Look inside of my circle at all my facts. That's going to be a different circle for other people. And that's going to impact the outcome of your judgments about, based on the facts, and other people's, including your audience. Here's my example. So I just did a piece for Forbes today, about an hour ago, on the budget deal, the new Murray Ryan budget deal that some people care a lot about. Apparently, including this is an issue for them that matters. So acknowledged. But for a lot of people, they're like, another, this is like, I'm tuning out. I can't care anymore about another deal that these beltway politicians are hammering out, and right? We all know how that sort of line of thought goes. And it's easy to share that line of thought. Nevertheless, we've got some heavy hitters on the right of center weighing in on the budget deal, saying yes, Paul Ryan is right. This is a good enough deal to embrace. It's better than the alternative that's available to us. We're not going to be able to reform government in the way that conservatives want unless we sort of put our heads down right now and trudge ahead in a responsible way. Because after all, there are so many Democrats in Congress that we can't really get transformative change now. We just can't. Sorry, you guys. Based on the facts in their circle of possibility, that's not just an answer. That's pretty much the answer. Mm-hmm. Given sort of the facts as a reform-minded, establishmentarian, conservative, with a close eye on Washington would describe them, that's the answer you're going to get. However, we all know that it's in fact just flatly untrue that the possibilities for transformative change in the way that we reform government have been foreclosed by the number of Democrats in Congress. Because, I don't know about you. Actually, I do know about you. You know as well as I do that it was just months ago that Justin Amash in the House and Rand Paul in the Senate almost spontaneously mobilized serious support across the aisle among Republicans and Democrats for radical change in the way governance works. The NSA, with drones, those are just two examples, but those are some pretty intense examples. When you had the establishments of both parties basically freaking out, as they do when this happens. Go back and look at the, when Hunter Thompson ran for sheriff of Aspen, and basically both parties, establishments of both parties threw in together and did everything in their power to stop him from becoming sheriff of Aspen. This is the way this works. When the radicals in both parties get together and have hope and hell of accomplishing transformative change in the way governance works, the establishments of both parties freak out, set aside their enmity, and figure out a way to keep the establishment intact. That's what happened with Amash and with Paul. But the point is, there is a real possibility now, and this is a possibility, that wouldn't have materialized, I don't think, were it not for what Snowden did. Mm-hmm. There's a real possibility for conservatives and progressives, liberals, people who are serious about reforming the government in a way that increases the possibility of basic independence in people's lives. Mm-hmm. Let's say that. This can be done, and it can be done even though there are a lot of Democrats in Congress. But we don't hear this from the establishment reformers on the right. And why not? Well, because if that was true, then maybe their argument in favor of this, this budget is not as forceful as it would otherwise be. Mm-hmm. So take that circle of facts and you just set that aside. We're not going to talk about that. And I think that's a great example of how you can be rigorous about the facts in a seriously committed way, but still find yourself in a position where you're foreclosing possibilities and you're pretending the possibilities that do exist don't, out of what seems to be a dedication to quote unquote the facts. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's right. And just one thing to quickly add: there's another great phrase that Jay Rosen has that he calls the Church of the Savvy. This is another, I guess, label he applies to mainstream journalism, and it's basically the idea that there is this circle of facts that is accepted by the establishment. And in the absence of being able to tell you what they really think about things, what journalists do is signal that they understand the circle of facts that the establishment understands and treats anything within that realm of possibility as savvy and possible and something that serious people talk about, and anything outside that circle of facts as frivolous and silly. Like, forget about whether it has merit or not, whether it ought to happen, whether it actually conceivably could happen. The fact that it probably won't happen given normal conventions of what happens in Washington. It's treated as unserious because of that. And I think that kind of bears on what you were saying. Before we go any longer on this, I want to make sure we get to this other great piece that you wrote for Forbes. It's about the passion economy and millennials. I will let you introduce it, but make sure when you do, you tell us what the passion economy is.
Right. So, as we all know, there's this sort of meandering conversation that's occasionally fruitful surrounding how millennials are responding to the crap economic times in which we live. Some of that conversation is about hipsters. Some of it's about the so-called sharing economy. Some of it is about what happens when young white people in a realm of diminishing expectations accept downward mobility in some shape or form. And that's interesting stuff to me. Part of that conversation that I took a stab at in the Forbes piece you mentioned was jumping off from a piece that made, I guess, two claims about millennials. One, which I endorse this claim, is one reaction to our economic situation and the general sort of culture surrounding it, is that millennials are perhaps more inclined to say, you know what, it's not all about just being able to afford a bigger house, a bigger car, better brands for me, for my kids, whatever. It's about spending my life doing stuff that is actually connected in some genuinely sort of authentic way to what I care about, what I am quote unquote passionate about. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that holds up, and I think that's on balance like great news for humanity. Right. Claim two, though, was well, what does it mean to do passion economy work? What's that look like? What's that entail? And the author's claim was, well, it means that people can now geek out on what they do for a living, and that's great because in today's economy, in today's world, geeking out is what makes the world go round. If you're an expert who is so enthusiastic about diving into the details of what it is that you love, and then you can get other people involved in those like intimate details of what it is that you love, then that can somehow generate sort of economic organization and productivity. Whether it's, think of a show like The Wire, right? Which is sort of just fully immersed in this incredibly complex world just teeming with detail. And, you can geek out about The Wire, you can geek out about Game of Thrones. And there's someone on the internet geeking out about pretty much every element of pop culture that matters today. And the idea is, whether you work for a tech company or a startup or, a hipster bar or whatever, there's something for everyone to geek out about. And the more that we geek out about it, the more passionate we are. And that's what's going to sort of make the economy work. Plausible. However, for a while now, I've been sort of concerned about what geeking out really is and how it might lead us astray. So in the piece, I suggest that there could be some nice things about getting enthusiastic about how the process of your passion project works. This is not the devil incarnate here. However, we do definitely have brains that are wired to enjoy the experience of watching ourselves like exert power on stuff or on other people, and kind of like marveling at the way that process works. I think that's just sort of part of our neurophysiological equipment. And I think history proves that out. And I think sort of like do some sociology studies or whatever, and that'll prove it out too. And therein lies the rub, I think, because if you look at, say, the realm of public policy, what you get are a bunch of people who say, look, we know the facts, we have the big data, we have the quant guys, we have our charticles, we understand reality. And that entitles us to geek out really hard about this stuff because, hey, we care about politics, we care about policy, we care about governance, and we're going to do all those things right because we have the right attitude and we have the right enthusiasm about these mechanisms that we're going to build. That seems like a good idea, but it oftentimes results in debacles. And those debacles in the realm of public policy oftentimes do not go punished, nor do the people who sort of perpetuate them.
Almost
right?
never.
It's sort of like on to the next, idea. I think, I was chatting with Peter Suderman of Reason Magazine years ago. He sort of tongue-in-cheek said, like, yeah, I think my book project is going to be, your idea is stupid and will probably never work. And it would be sort of like this history of how really people with big brains and big hearts came up with big ideas and tried to implement them. And it was basically like, we would have been better off if you just hadn't bothered. Right. And that, those people are geeking out really hard about stuff they really, really care about. And it's, you're in danger of seeming like a big jerk and like negative person if you tell them to maybe check themselves before they wreck the rest of us. But like, look at the track record. And I think that's something that, that could bite us, not just with public policy, but like, this is why people are worried about what's going on in Silicon Valley, where it's like, ooh, well, give the nerds the power to accomplish this kind of massive sort of systemic change. And then they have this kind of like enthusiasm level about setting up these mechanisms and then observing them as they turn society and everyone in it into these kinds of objects, which you can actually watch them be transformed by our power, right? It's all super exciting, but there are perils there. And And in that sense, geeking out is not the same as being passionate about creating fruitful possibilities that human beings can share.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's important to draw that distinction and to not get swept up in this idea that, you know, if we have sort of big hearts and big brains and big ideas, like the rest is going to be happy land. It's just not necessarily.
Well, we are at just about an hour, so I would love to go for more, but we should probably call it and leave the rest for a future blogging hedge.
Anytime.
All right. Well, thank you, James, and please check out James's page on Forbes, check out my page on The Atlantic, and we'll see you next time.